Welcome to our webinar. Today we are hosting an expert discussion on what it takes to be successful when selling to hospitals. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that CMR Institute has launched a new module on selling in the hospital environment. The module explores today's dynamic hospital environment and what it means for those selling life science products and services. Also, be sure to download the handout, which provides some key planning questions you can use when developing a profile for your hospital customers. So now I'd like to welcome our expert panelists today. First, let me introduce Dr. Jeffrey Farber. Dr. Farber is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Population Health at Mount Sinai Health System and the CEO of Mount Sinai Care, the system's accountable care organization. Dr. Farber, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
My pleasure. I look forward to the discussion. Hello, everybody.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Harlow. Dr. Harlow is Assistant Vice President for Professional Services and Chief Pharmacy Officer at Martin Health System. Dr. Harlow, thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
I'd also like to introduce Michelle O'Connor. Michelle is President and CEO of CMR Institute. Michelle, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Laura, and good morning, everyone.
And I'm Laura Hegwer, the moderator today. So throughout today's webinar, we encourage you to submit questions for our panelists. We have another Laura Topping, who's the Manager of Client Solutions at CMR Institute, who will collect your questions today. Laura, would you explain how participants can submit their questions, please?
Sure, thank you. And first, on behalf of CMR Institute, we'd like to thank each of you for attending today's webinar. Please submit any questions you have through the webinar interface by typing them into the space provided, and we will be taking questions from the audience as time permits.
All right, thanks, Laura. Why don't we go ahead and get started then? So I'd like to start out by asking the audience a quick question. Why are you attending the webinar today? This will help our panel gear their responses to best meet your needs. So please pick A if you are attending because you are new to hospital sales. Pick B if you are experienced in hospital sales but wanted a refresher. Pick C if you are responsible for training hospital sales teams. Or pick D if you are not in hospital sales or training but are just interested in the topic. So please make your selection now, and then we'll get started. Looks like the votes are coming in.
Yes, give it a few more seconds, a few more still coming in here. Okay, looks like most people have voted, and it turns out most people chose B. They're experienced in hospital sales but want a refresher, with a close second being responsible for hospital sales teams training.
Okay, good. So we've got a nice mix of experienced hospital sales teams and some hospital sales trainers as well. So that's great. Thanks for joining us today. So over the past few years, hospitals, particularly integrated delivery networks, have gained more clout in terms of market access. I'd like to talk to the panel about some of the organizational changes in hospitals that may present some challenges and opportunities for life science companies. So let's start with a trend toward physician employment. Dr. Farber, can you explain how this trend is affecting hospitals and how it may influence physician decision-making about products?
You bet, Laura. Excellent first question. The trend towards having more employed physicians than voluntary private docs with privileges at hospitals continues, and the speed with which that transformation is happening is quite fast. What you have then is a different paradigm where the hospital now has a lot more control and ability to influence care pathways and some care standardization. so that they could start, focusing more on customer centricity and thinking about the delivery as a true service that people have choice over sort of where they want to go by having a standard, encounter experience, and it helps with their branding. It's, clearly a move that allows a lot more, again, centralized sort of control and integration with the physicians, because it's easier and more efficient to do so when you've got representatives representing the employed physicians as opposed to each being independent business people.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. So kind of a similar trend is centralized decision-making. And many hospitals are centralizing their supply chain and their value analysis committee structures. So Dr. Harlow, can you talk about this from the pharmacy perspective and discuss the implications for manufacturers?
Right, and actually this goes hand in hand with what Jeff was just saying about physician employment. And one of the reasons why you see this is because there's this consolidation toward creating a value proposition and creating uniformity in, as Doc said, these care pathways. And so, and I would extend that out to integrated delivery systems that are contractual in nature, lots of what people are calling high-performance networks and things like that, where you have hospital entities also contracting with umbrella organizations that include a group of doctors that may or may not be owned. And you're seeing everyone move to these, this idea of centralized decision-making, particularly around product selection and a value analysis for where those things are most effective and how to use them. And so this idea of centralized decision-making is casting a broader and broader net as time moves forward.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. So those were some of the challenges. Let's talk a little bit about some of the opportunities then that may arise from some of these organizational changes in hospitals. Now, Dr. Farber, many hospitals, particularly those that are engaged in alternative payment models, have been adding C-level executives in charge of population health management as well as care coordinators. Can you talk a little bit about this trend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really critical because it varies tremendously by market, and the speed with which this is happening is also within a market dependent on non-hospital strategy. So it's important, when you're involved in sales with the hospitals, to understand where they're at and what their strategy is in terms of transforming from a traditional fee-for-service hospital with the incentive to fill beds, right, put heads in the beds, to how much they may or may not be moving their business model to value, right, as a population health manager, and then the hospital becomes a cost center as opposed to a revenue center. And that's going to be really important to understand, because it'll depend on the approach and the opportunities to think outside the box in terms of types of partnerships that I'm sure we'll discuss later. But the population health management people you should be looking for, seeing what they talk about it on both news and publications. It's going to be Chief Population Health Officer is often the lead for that work and that activity that hospitals start doing when they transform their business model. Chief Clinical Integration Officer, where they actually start building the network, and it's helpful when you have, as we talked earlier, a larger and growing base of employed physicians to do that. But the network includes, and you're going to want to know for your market and the folks that you're trying to interact with, how much of the work is still done by and how relevant are the sizable voluntary physicians who are part of that network. And again, it's going to change, I think, the way that you think about who you can approach.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. I also wanted to ask you about another trend. I know that many of the larger hospitals and health systems have added innovation offices or even started their own venture capital funds to help bring some new products to market. Can you talk a little bit about this trend and how it might actually be an opportunity for companies to partner with hospitals on innovation?
Yeah, that's right, Laura. I think that's a really key point, and I know we're not the only ones, where I am in New York and Mount Sinai that are doing this, but a lot of organizations are starting to think about, well, how could we commercialize our intellectual property? How can we start capitalizing on a lot of the innovations, right, that happen? That's core to the culture for many of these provider organizations. And so they've developed capabilities, within the organization, whether it's a technology transfer office or a innovations office, from straight, patents and protections on IP to joint ventures and, business opportunities with other stakeholders in the market, which is where, to Laura's point, this opens up, I think, a tremendous opportunity in thinking about, what kind of, value-added services might you have from your work, right, in the life sciences industry that could collaborate and work nicely with whatever the IP is that the hospital or health system is trying to grow, right, and get out there to market. And I think many are now, thinking much more broadly about different types of partners for, joint ventures or, just other types of investments in these new ventures.
Great, thanks, Dr. Farber. So now that we've kind of got an overview of, some of the key organizational changes that are happening in hospitals, Michelle, I was hoping we could turn to you and maybe get your take on what some of these trends actually mean for sales teams.
Sure, Laura, thanks. I think that, it's important to remember that most hospitals are now part of an IDN. So sales professionals need to understand that IDNs impact treatment decisions through the clinical practice guidelines that they impose on network providers. Physicians are typically incentivized to use these pathways, and the guidelines can vary pretty significantly across geographic areas. So I think it's also important to consider local market dynamics within your area. And then both Dr. Harlow and Dr. Farber referred to the continued trend towards centralized decision-making, meaning fewer decision makers. I really believe that this underscores the importance of knowing the hospitals in your territory so that you can properly target your approach towards those individuals who are making the decision or are key influencers in that decision. And then in terms of the need to position products for outpatient care, remember that hospitals serve multiple parts of the healthcare continuum, from primary and specialty care to post-acute care in the ambulatory setting. And sales professionals should really consider the care facilities and the areas where their products and service can bring the most value within those networks that Dr. Farber just mentioned, because I think it can vary within, within each system, within each hospital system. So that's very important. And then again, as Dr. Farber mentioned, in terms of innovation, as health systems continue to establish these types of centers and create these new positions, I think that that's a new entry point for sales. Dr. Farber mentioned these centers are looking at new models of care, and they're also thinking more broadly about how to solve difficult problems, and I think that that's an area where industry can certainly help. And those innovation centers, they may be a good place to pitch a partnership or an innovative program that your company may already have in place or may be thinking about putting in place. And then finally, I would just add that I think hospitals are also looking at how data can inform and help with innovation. And this could be an area where companies can partner with health systems as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Dr. Farber or Dr. Harlow, was there anything that you wanted to add or comment on in terms of what some of the trends mean for sales teams?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Just real quickly, I think Michelle's spot on here, and the one key take-home that I would suggest is, really thinking specifically, the more you know about your customers and where they're at in this continuum and what they're focusing on, and then being really free to think outside the box. I don't think we've got all the answers out there, and if it was easy, it would be done. But there is now this willingness, this open-mindedness, and this confluence of interest now where the alignment makes sense, and I'm excited about the prospects here of what can be offered.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think to really consider, and we've talked around it a little bit, and certainly everyone is in the business of population management now. And so I think it's a real challenge in some ways for sales professionals to be pigeonholed as acute care and or primary care. And I know a lot of organizations still use that, and for obvious historic reasons, but I think that as a sales professional, you've got to look at the continuum of care irrespective of which side of the hospital wall that you're on. Because when we talk about care pathways now, we're not really talking about order sets alone, and I think historically we've really looked at it that way. One of the things you've got to consider is where your product or product lines lie on that continuum of care, because when we talk about pathways here, for instance, here at Martin, we created a program for complex chronic disease patients that spans from the time they get to the ER when they've had a failure in their care on the chronic side, all the way out to 240 days post-discharge from the hospital. And so if you're looking at that long of a quote-unquote pathway or decision tree, it's really important for you to understand the organization that you're selling to and how they handle these things, because your entry point, in point of fact, even if it's an acute care product, could be elsewhere in the organization. So you really have to look at these things carefully. And again, think outside the box. So I know we say that all the time, but it's time for all of us to be creative because, and I've said this before in other venues, we will not be successful without you guys, and certainly you will not be successful without us.
Very good point. Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Okay, so Michelle, let me turn this back to you again. Can you talk about what some of these trends mean now for training departments?
Yes, absolutely. So I think to truly impact market access, sales professionals have to have a strong understanding of current market forces that are impacting their customers and the payers, including the continued move away from fee-for-service to value-based models, and then the implications of those models for the products that they offer. So, for example, having a strong knowledge and understanding of a hospital's reimbursement structure will help sales professionals appreciate what drives purchasing decisions, and from there, how to best position their products and services. And in terms of evidence-based medicine, I think arming sales professionals with safety and efficacy data is not enough anymore, and I think most of us recognize that. They also need a strong understanding of how their products compare with other treatment options and an understanding of how to best present approved clinical or evidence-based data. And I do believe that it's critical for sales teams to understand where their products fit into those clinical pathways of hospitals. And they have to understand also how they can find and then use that information. So I think there's a role for training within that as well. And then in terms of developing business acumen, Dr. Farber and Dr. Haller both mentioned this, but understanding value from each customer's perspective is really important. And I think that training can help by providing the tools that can help profile and segment their customers and then identify their needs based on those roles and determine what they value, and then how sales can then best respond. So a curriculum that includes training on the changing healthcare market, changing decision makers, and new payment models, I think are critical to enhancing business acumen. And I also believe it's important to provide training on the roles and responsibilities of a wide range of decision makers. So, training for selling about the doc. I think, we've moved on to where many of decision makers are going to be different from a traditional call point in a fee-for-service model. So, for example, training should include understanding the makeup of a P&T committee and a value analysis committees and what impacts or drives their decision making, and also learn what members of the C-suite value, as those individuals may be the primary influencers or decision makers for products and services. So, Dr. Farber mentioned several new titles, also in terms of, the CFO or even the CEO within some organizations. So I think to develop advocates at that level, sales professionals need training on different business models that the hospital may operate under or the health system, again, as well as the reimbursement models that are impacting how your company's products are utilized. And I think, speaking to the market, the individual market perspective, this is an area where I think field trainers can really play a key role by helping to implement training on a regional level that really helps align the specific training needs of that region to the various market conditions across the country.
Thanks, Michelle. So Dr. Farber or Dr. Harlow, do you want to follow up with any comments on what Michelle just mentioned?
This is Dave. So the one thing that I would say is, never before has listening been more important, because, and Dr. Farber has mentioned this, and we've talked a lot about innovation. And if you think about it, innovation, if organizations are going to be innovative, then by definition that's disruptive. And it's disruptive in lots of different ways. And novel ways, how organizations approach care. You may have one organization that is approaching population management from a particular strategy in one end of the state, and you could have somebody that is focused 180 degrees differently on that, and how your product portfolio fits into their ideas and in their decision tree really matters. And listening, the most valuable representatives to me have always been and continue to be the ones that listen to what I'm trying to accomplish and brainstorm with me about how we can work together toward what the goals of the organization are.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Dr. Farber.
This is Jeff. I'll add one specific comment to this, and I ditto everything that David and Michelle said. So to give you a sort of concrete example, and this happens to me in my position, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's something you'll encounter when you're out there with your clients and customers. You're going to want to know what the organization that you're thinking about developing deeper relationships with, what their preference is for having an in-house capability for a core function versus their openness and receptivity to assistance. For example, I think there's opportunity around some call wraparound services, care coordination that Laura mentioned earlier, patient navigation, issues around motivational interviewing that clearly can impact medication adherence, as an example. I would be direct and try and understand, is this something that the organization considers a core competence and they're developing those capabilities in-house and they're doing it, and so that door for that issue might be closed or is closed, or is this, are they at a point where they're open to assistance with this, and is this a service that you think you could provide in terms of, again, that value-added services beyond the medication or the device? I think that's, a good example of the type of way to think about, approaching the hospital partners.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Okay, so let's ask another question of the audience. So how do most hospitals control their pharmacy costs? Pick A if you think it's by using cost accounting strategies. Pick B if you think it's by designating preferred products on their formulary. Pick C if you believe it's by using pathways in the electronic health record. Pick D if you think it's by engaging in value-based contracting. Or pick E if you think it's all of the above. So please make your selection now, and then we'll talk about the results. Laura, how are we doing with the polling?
It looks like most people have voted. A few more coming in here. But an overwhelming majority, 87%, selected D, all of the above, while the second option, B, had a few votes, but again, that majority, all of the above.
Okay, so a few people chose the designating preferred products on formulary, but most chose all of the above. Okay, so Dr. Harlow, let me turn this back to you. So do you agree with the audience? And also as a hospital pharmacy director, can you maybe talk a little bit about your priorities when it comes to managing pharmacy costs, and maybe also tell us a bit about some of the strategies that you're using to manage pharmacy costs?
Right. I mean, I think the audience is right. I mean, you do see this kind of a mishmash of how organizations approach this. And what I'd say to that is really a function of how sophisticated markets are in, again, population management and value-based propositions, and this move away from fee-for-service. Because the further we gravitate toward that, the more you're going to see preferred products and pathways really mattering. Because what we do know is, let me get to the heart of what you asked me. The way that we approach that here at Martin is, what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and then what's the most cost-effective, evidence-based way to get there? And that's how our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee functions. And for those of you that don't know, and there's a misnomer out there that pharmacy governs the P&T committee, and that's not actually true. P&T is a medical committee, and there is, for P&Ts worth their salt, and there's a lot of them out there, a lot of things other than cost go into the consideration of how we use, where we deploy products on pathways and how they're used. It's a very robust process. Lots of research goes on in the background to determine for the organization where these products are. And so when we're looking at that, what the evidence-based pathway to that outcome matters, because what we do know in healthcare is that variations in evidence-based care are what cause poor outcomes. Poor outcomes keep you out of the environment of being able to even engage in value-based contracting, because you have to know what your cost of doing business is. And to that end, what we're getting to now is, in this era of bundle payments, what is the cost for us to do these bundles? Because again, if you don't know how much it costs you to do it, you would be averse to enter into a contract that is value-based, because you don't know really how much it's going to cost you over and over again on average. So I think we're looking at all of these things for certain, but we are gravitating more and more toward this idea of where things are on pathways and where they are, again, in the outcome. So I don't really care as much anymore if I get the absolute cheapest product, if that product shaves a couple days length of stay in the context of an overall pathway in care. And that's thinking outside of the pharmacy silo anymore. And I'd say about 50% of the pharmacy services in the country really do that well, and the ones that aren't, their CEOs and CFOs are looking to them to change their model.
Thank you, Dr. Harlow. Those are some great points. So, I'm kind of curious as to what the implications are then for prescribing physicians that are actually not employed by a hospital. Dr. Farber, do you think any of these strategies that are primarily applied to the acute setting could eventually affect affiliated physicians in outpatient settings?
Yeah, Laura, I do, and here's why. I mean, I think there still is a role, and there's still a market for voluntary physicians in the community. Increasingly, however, with the amount of regulatory requirements for reporting, you think about MACRA, for example, with Medicare saying, hey, we're done with the old model. I mean, it's as big a change as the DRG system for hospitals, right, back in 1982. We're not just going to pay anymore off the fee schedule. We're going to have, swings upwards of 9%, right, higher or lower based on the value that we perceive that you deliver, right, to our patients. And there's reporting requirements around quality. There's reporting requirements around meaningful use type work with electronic health records. There's reporting requirements around clinical practice improvement programs, not too dissimilar to what's required for lots of board certification, maintenance. But to do this then as a solo, individual physician is going to be next to impossible. And I think you'll see a lot of physicians who stay independent but join a clinically integrated network, not an employment model, not necessarily an ACO, right? But a network where they can get a lot of the supports and management services that they'll need to remain, relevant and viable, right, in this new system. And so part of that's going to be the same type of work and the same type of philosophy that we've been discussing over the past 15 minutes or so around this move to value. So my short answer, I'm sorry that was so long-winded, but the short answer is yes. I think it's relevant, and that was an attempt at an explanation of why.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Dr. Harlow, do you have any thoughts to add on whether these strategies are going to extend then to physicians in ambulatory settings?
I would absolutely echo what Dr. Farber just said, and the pace at which this is happening probably needs to be underscored. Because, for instance, just this morning, we were talking, our hospital organization is in the process of standing up what you'd call a high-performance network with non-affiliated physicians. And inherent in that is a contracting process for us for a product portfolio for that network that is historically, and that's unaffiliated physicians, because this legal entity ends up being an entity of its own, and I won't go into all the details, but the point being is that the pathways that are effective and the evidence and the outcomes by our own data and what we use and where we use it, whoever builds a better mousetrap will follow that process. And so all of those prescribing practices and that are positive toward positive outcomes are going to be the things that we look at, and the physicians themselves are all going to be incentivized because they're all going to have skin in the game. So absolutely.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Okay, so let's then talk about some of the specific strategies that sales professionals can use to optimize their success in a hospital selling environment. Michelle, why don't we start with you? What are some ways that sales professionals can demonstrate their competence and their value in a hospital environment?
Okay, thanks, Laura. I think that, and I've said this before, but I think, again, it's worth saying that sales professionals can optimize their success by staying on top of market changes so that they're viewed as credible and competent. This is truly an opportunity to distinguish yourself and your expertise in an area that's important to the decision maker or the influencer that you may be speaking to. And do your homework, research the hospital. I think it's important to understand the organizational structure, policies that may affect access, and also key initiatives that that hospital or that hospital system is focused on. And in terms of value, gaining an understanding of who makes the decision to utilize products and build advocates among these people. I think that's a common refrain here, is that there's a lot of opportunity. So I think remembering that every hospital will be different. So it's important to understand the degree to which they're integrated or not, and then to also know the key payers within that hospital system or that IDN. And remember to stay focused on value, and both Dr. Harlow and Dr. Farber mentioned this, but understanding that value may be defined differently by different decision makers within a hospital. So again, it's important to listen well and stay informed so that you can respond to the needs and expectations of those different customers throughout the health system. So for example, a CFO might be interested in how your products will help reduce costs, while clinical decision makers and physician leaders on P&T or value and access committees may be more interested, as Dr. Harlow mentioned, in how your products can help with population health initiatives or other areas that their system is focused on.
Thanks, Michelle. Dr. Farber, did you have any comments that you wanted to add to what Ms. Schell just mentioned about what sales teams can do to optimize their success in the hospital environment?
Yeah, actually, Laura, I do. I have one very specific comment to add, and it relates to what I talked about earlier. There's a tremendous amount of concern in hospitals now around MACRA, this law, right, that replaced the sustainable growth rate formula. And let me just comment a second on the political thing here. This was passed, I think it was 92 or 94 senators, voting in favor of it. It was widely bipartisan, and I don't believe it's, on the chopping block as everything else very well may be because of the change in administration. This is, Medicare and the government as a purchaser of health insurance saying, we want to get better value, right, for the money that we spend. So hospitals are really scratching their heads, delivery systems, clinical integrated networks, provider groups, organizations. What does this mean? How do I do it if I don't participate in what's considered an advanced alternative payment model? Then, by default, I have to participate in this MIPS program, this merit-based incentive payment system. And so, to Michelle's point around, staying on top of the market changes and providing, education and information, this is one that's the flip side of the coin of knowing the market and everything's different and locally where people are at. By and large, everybody's worried about MIPS because it's a national program that applies to everybody. So I would say, you don't have to do too much homework to figure out whether MIPS is a concern. It is. And then there's, quality reporting where there's, again, potential avenues. Think about some common PQRS measures like, tobacco cessation screening and assistance with that. ACE inhibitors or ARBs for heart failure, systolic heart failure. Diabetes control, so the percent of patients who are not controlled with the greater than 9%. There's a whole host of MIPS eligible measures, and they're all publicly available on the CMS website. So you can see what those quality measures are and what might relate to the portfolio of products and medications that you have. And then there's the performance improvement too, which could very well be around, vaccination campaigns, for example. Influenza immunization annually, the pneumococcal vaccination for older adults. There are performance opportunities like that that also have scoring and requirements for physicians to do to get credit for MIPS, where again, I think this opens up just a new opportunity. So MIPS is my suggested take-home four-letter word for the day.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Dr. Harlow, what about you? Do you have any thoughts on ways that sales teams can demonstrate their competence and value to the hospital?
There's just no way to overstate what Dr. Farber just said, because as he, and you might have caught what he said earlier about this has the same gravity as the DRG system had before, and quite frankly, it's to me it's more complex because now we're stitching together players who never even played well in the sandbox before. For instance, the non-aligned physicians with physician organizations that are aligned directly to hospitals and all these kind of things. These quality programs, regardless of how you view them, they're very, very unlikely to be flash in the pans because we've seen these programs hanging around at Blue Cross, at Humana, and now of course at CMS. And this is the lever they're going to use to drive down cost and improve care, be that on the acute care side or in this case what we're talking about is on the ambulatory side, but it all goes together. And so it's outcomes, it's evidence-based processes, and again, evidence in your own data, right? So what I can do here in my neck of the woods, for instance, might not be able to be duplicated exactly in New York City for whatever the reason happens to be. But our ability to generate positive outcomes and drive down cost and proof of those outcomes, there are going to be people that rise to the top and people that simply just don't want to play. And it's going to be very tough for those physicians or physician groups to survive in this new environment because I just don't see it going away. And that's why we were talking about the things from a purchase. I mean, it's everything. It's purchasing. It's clinical pathway development. It's all of these things. But those are things you used to hear on the acute care side only. No more. That exists right now and will continue to evolve in the ambulatory side.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Okay, so let's move on, and I'd like to get a sense for which topic our audience members are focused on most in their training for hospital sales teams. Please pick A for business acumen, pick B for market knowledge, pick C for selling skills, or pick D if your company thinks that all are equally important. Please make your selection now, and then we're going to dig a little deeper into what trainers can do.
Okay, Laura, it looks like everyone voted quickly on this one. So let's close it here. And the majority came in at 68%, all are equally important. And a tie for second place was business acumen and selling skills.
Okay, very good. Michelle, what do you think about these results? And also, what can trainers do to optimize their team's success in a hospital selling environment?
Sure. I would agree that all are important, Laura. I think that I would agree with the audience in that case. And I think that trainers can help optimize the success of their sales teams by arming them with the tools that they need to succeed, many of which we've mentioned here today. Understanding that local market and keeping up with what's changing, I think, are both important. And I think that trainers can help by providing ongoing access to information and tools in these areas. And I know that that's a challenge for a lot of training organizations because it's literally changing daily. Some of the content that we have on macro, for example, or MIPS, continues to evolve and change. So that can be a heavy lift for trainers, but there are partners that can help in that area. And I think that it's also important to ensure commercial teams understand new advanced payment models. Dr. Farber made his plea, as did Dr. Harlow. We have to understand the impact of MACRA and MIPS and initiatives like Triple Aim and population health, so that our sales teams can position their products accordingly and be viewed as a credible resource within the hospital system. And within the decision makers that they call on. Ensuring that sales teams have the business acumen that they need to establish credibility to help them seek out mutual goals and establish those important relationships, I think, is another area where that will really help position them to succeed, from whether they're calling on the C-suite to clinical decision makers. And finally, I would just mention, the credibility that's been, mentioned several times. But, the environment is changing very rapidly. But as both of our health system execs mentioned today, it's also an environment that's embracing innovation. So I think that as trainers, we can really help commercial teams prepare for the opportunities that present themselves in an environment of innovation. So I think it can also be an exciting time to be a trainer and to be in training.
Thanks, Michelle. So, I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions from the audience. So why don't we go ahead and move toward some of those questions. And Laura Topping, are there any questions that we've received from our participants today?
Yes, we do. First, Chris asks, what kind of alternative payment models are your organizations engaged in, and how does this affect your choice of products?
Dr. Farber, do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, you bet. Great question. So here at Mount Sinai in New York City, we're involved in OCM, the Oncology Care Model from CMS, which is an advanced alternative payment model. We're involved in BPCI as well as CJR, the voluntary bundle payment for care improvement program and the mandatory joint replacement bundle, comprehensive joint replacement CJR. And we've also got, they're not APMs, but just in the context, I think more broadly, maybe what you were getting at, I hope, and apologize if this isn't what you're interested in, lots of contracts across all lines of business, for Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial, that have us taking the clinical and financial responsibility for total cost of care. And so there's, shared savings agreements, there's upside and downside within risk corridors, and then there's a portfolio of contracts that are full risk already at this point. So we have a lot of that. And how does it affect the second point, our choice of products? It affects very much. And to be very frank here, some of the contracts more than others, right? Because we're being tactical in what we've got and how can we be successful in the contracts that we've committed to. So, MSSP, for example, the Medicare Shared Savings Program, ACO, which we also have, I didn't mention, we're not responsible for pharmacy costs directly, right? That is, Part D medications. Though, of course, as David was explaining very well earlier, the value proposition and total cost of care, right, and experience, whether it's readmission reduction, ambulatory sensitive conditions, rates themselves, for things like COPD, asthma, heart failure, remaining low because of the medication, right, part of a treatment plan that does that, that's important. But the medication price itself in something like that where we don't and are not financially responsible for the cost is different than it is for the books of business where we have, let's say, 150,000 Medicare and Medicaid lives for which we're fully at risk, including all expenses, including pharmacy spend. So it really depends like that. And then there are, some different work groups. It's a little challenging because it's the transformation, right? It's the time when we're positioning and moving the business from fee-for-service to fee-for-value, and we still have lots of feet that are, in both worlds. So there's not an easy one centralized place where all this happens. To some degree, there's parts that vary by contract, like I mentioned. I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop because otherwise I'll go on to 1 o'clock. The OCM piece, for example, the way we structure it is it's a group, right, that's led by our clinical leadership in oncology, of course with administrative support that is leading that piece, and the Pop Health centralized system level function is supporting that, but they're leading it, and so they're working on their choice of products, medications, specifically, infusions, what they want to do, separate and in parallel to other efforts that are happening for other contracts. Let me pause there because that was a long answer to a very good question.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Dr. Harlow, did you want to add anything?
I would echo again. I find myself just nodding as Dr. Farber goes along. Some of the things that Mount Sinai, obviously, as big an organization as it is, participates in, we wouldn't necessarily participate in. But let me give you a little caveat, kind of where everybody in the country is. He mentioned CJR and some of the other programs, and I think inherent potentially in Chris's question is, how common is this idea of, we've talked about value-based contracting and so forth, but really where is it at? And for instance, is here in South Florida, we were basically the physicians here were, you will have to drag me kicking and screaming out of the fee-for-service, I eat what I kill mentality. And in point of fact, what happened was one day the orthopedic docs were having that mentality, and the very next day CMS came in and said, thou shalt do bundled payments, literally within 30 days. And so that was a shot across the bow for everyone that this is not just conjecture anymore. And the thing about that is that can happen in a 30-day span. As quickly as these payment models are rolling out and people are thinking about them, what it made everybody realize was back to this idea of doing your cost of business and how much does it cost you to do these things. So our cost accounting departments and how we review our own data about our own outcomes and everything, we became very introspective about that very quickly. And I think every other organization is too. So even those, even those that may or may not be completely invested in this idea that they currently have value-based contracts, I assure you that they all have an eye on getting there. And helping them get there and having that conversation with them is probably really beneficial to you, even if they don't have any right now.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Laura, how about maybe another question from the audience?
Sure. Karen says, how do physician incentives really work when it comes to population health management?
Dr. Farber, do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, that's another great question. I spent a good amount of my time in my role as Chief Medical Officer here for Pop Health thinking about that, and I've been, quite frankly, changing my opinion here and solidifying a bit more around the notion that I think we've overplayed the financial incentive piece too much here with physicians, and that's not really what's driving physicians. I mean, yes, you know, there's a lot out there, right? The BPCI program I mentioned, CJR, part of the core of the program is legitimized and legal gain sharing, right? So there's dollars tied to the performance for total cost of care for episodes, right, beyond the hospital, and you can share that, you know, as a hospital system with the physicians, which without that legal protection, you can't, right? That's not allowed. And there's a lot like that. There's a lot of pay for performance, you know, there's even pay for reporting. And I'm not so comfortable with it anymore. I mean, I think I'm not sure it works, and I think it distracts from a much more powerful message of, you know, it's a profession. This is our professional responsibility. It's, you know, patient first. It's, you know, thinking about efficiency as well as quality and value. It's important. We have a professional fiduciary responsibility to the entire system here, to the country, really, you know, to spend these $3 trillion that we're spending more thoughtfully. And so the incentives around, you know, penalties, the sticks, the incentives around carrots, you know, the P for P, again, I'm just much less enamored with. I think that could be a whole other topic here for discussion, which again, I spend a significant amount of time in it, but I'm moving much less in that direction, and especially as I'm rolling out new programs and asking doctors to change their behavior for what they do, I'm much less enthusiastic about trying to tie, you know, dollars to it, as opposed to fundamentally transforming the way we get paid to value, and then using those dollars to fund, you know, the transformation work. That is the paradigm that I like to work with. But I may very well be in the minority here, but that's my opinion.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Dr. Harlow, did you want to add anything? If not, we can go to another question.
Actually, I do, and I tend to agree with Dr. Farber about that. I think there is value in incentivizing. For instance, when we talk about these integrated networks that combine a group of doctors, in point of fact, physicians are really overwhelmed as a general rule. I mean, the reason why you can't get FaceTime with a physician is because they got lots to do. And I think in certain incentives that are not necessarily financial, but support services that are incentive, you know, to help them, because at the end of the day, hopefully we all got into this business to make people better and help them get the best care that they can, and we take a lot of pride in doing that. And so I think what you're seeing is the organizations standing up of what you might think of as profit sharing, so that as we all move this ball forward toward a value-based proposition, we all share in the benefit. And then along the way, be they products or be they services that we underpin physician groups with. For instance, we're sending pharmacists into the primary care office to help them with complex disease management patients. And again, speaking of things that could go on forever, we won't talk about that. But all these different things to help physicians in their day-to-day, and also incentivize them in some way to, and incentives don't necessarily are financial. They can be quality of life incentives, things like that. So it still remains to be seen what the sweet spot is for financial incentives.
Thanks, Dr. Harlow. Laura, how about another question from the audience?
Absolutely, sure. When looking at innovation offices to help bring new products to market, Patrick asked, are Chief Quality and Chief Safety Officers involved, and how do you reach these C-suite personnel if they are a part of the approval process?
Dr. Farber, do you want to start us off? And then maybe Michelle, we can bounce it to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that hospitals are increasingly leaning upon often physicians for that role as a chief quality officer or chief safety officer, often combined as a chief quality and safety officer. I think it's a little different just to put out there. There's the chief patient experience officer, which is out there too, which often focuses on safety and in a sense quality in terms of the customer experience. But the more traditional medical leadership that's involved in that is no doubt, you know, at the table in those decisions to be made, and it is an avenue, right, to approach. You'd have to, you know, find out who it is. Often these types of positions are going to be published. I mean, they're going to be a broadcast news about it. It's a promotion. It's a, you know, honored position. And so you'll probably be able to find that, and a little bit about the person and when this happened and what they're focusing on in order to initiate some outreach. Same thing would be, whatever foot you have in the door with the existing relationship owner. Ask them, and what do they have and who does what, and it could be different again in each organization, but some I would imagine would be quite involved, and also might be the one who's more open to thinking outside the box, going back to the beginning of the hour and sort of the theme from the earlier part. That person would probably be, more philosophically aligned with some thoughts you may have about where to go.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. Michelle, do you have any thoughts on how salespeople can reach these members of the C-suite?
Sure. I think that Dr. Farber mentioned how to find them, and also touched on making sure that you understand what their value proposition may be, and going way back to what Dr. Harlow said about really listening well to and listening to the full picture so that you can understand truly what it is that is influencing them, what is their hot button issue, what are they trying to impact, and in some cases you may be taking those thoughts and ideas back to someone else within your organization. And I think that part of the question was around kind of the approval process, and I think that depending on where your specific role within an organization, you may have some latitude in terms of innovation and partnering, or you may not, but your input into that process is extremely important. So making sure that what you're hearing is going up the ladder to those people who can help you or can help with some of these innovative partnerships, I think is really important.
Thanks, Michelle. So we probably have time for maybe just one more quick question. So Laura, what have we received from the audience?
Well, a few participants are interested in risk sharing. So specifically, Mary Beth asks, are your organizations engaging in or open to contracts with life science companies that include risk sharing? If so, how are these working so far?
Dr. Harlow, can I start that with you, and then
yes.
go to Dr. Farber?
Where I would say that we are right now is we are looking at how we would approach that. And honestly, we haven't wrapped our head around what that looks like because, quite frankly, we've not been approached by, we hear a lot about those sorts of things, but we haven't really been approached by a life science company with a proposition that we could consider. We know that there are potentially some out there, but at least to this point, I don't know of any that have approached us about that. But that being said, we certainly would be open to that prospect.
Dr. Farber?
Yeah, this Jeff, I think same point. We have had some dialogue with some life sciences partners around, brainstorming ideas of what things could look like. We're actively engaged in expanding our risk-sharing agreements to include those outside of the growing clinical integrated network that we're building, so other, non-core provider organizations and partners. So think about the post-acute space, home care, skilled nursing facilities, subacute rehab partners. What does that mean, and how do we do that? We're not there yet, and so it's the same boat, I'd say, with the life sciences. But absolutely, open and have the appetite for thinking about how to structure something like that. I would think there's also opportunity in specific avenues. Again, if there's a real, thought that's been worked out that you have for a specific product, a specific niche, meets the need of the potential partner that you're in your area that you're looking for, then that's the discussion we're interested in having.
Thanks, Dr. Farber. So those were some excellent questions from our audience. Unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up. So I would like to thank our panelists for their time today. Dr. Farber, thank you.
My pleasure, Laura. Thank you so much.
And Dr. Harlow, thank you.
Thank you guys so much, and happy St. Patrick's Day, guys.
And Michelle O'Connor, thank you as well.
Thank you, Laura, and I agree. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
And I also wanted to thank our participants for joining us. So if you have any questions about today's webinar or CMR Institute's learning programs, please contact CMR at the number or the email on your screen. Thanks again, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laura.